Well, thank you for your time, Charles. We're just continuing on what we were talking about in terms of what learning and development leaders and learning and development officers may look to consider in terms of how they go about designing, developing training, taking into consideration social learning, user-generated content, measuring learning and performance, and big data analytics. And there's a whole lot of buzzwords, I suppose, I've just thrown out there, but it does mean that we need to look at the way our teams design and develop training and their roles. And I know we were talking before around performance and measurement and mapping KPIs for the business and measuring inwards. And I suppose all of that and all those buzzwords and all those things we need to do, I suppose. Well, I guess, do you have any thoughts or ideas or advice of what people could do in terms of moving away from designing and developing, embracing user-generated content versus not being order takers, but to add value back into the business of how they're going about creating data based on, showing evidence of the value that learning has hitting the KPIs of the business in a way?
Yeah, Rod, it's a bit like, I always think it's a bit like eating the elephant. You do it little bits at the time, but we have been discussing things like metrics. Which metrics do we use? Using stakeholder metrics, measuring the right stuff, basically, which is meaningful to our stakeholders. And we've also talked about user-generated content and how we exploit all that experience, knowledge, expertise that sits out there in our organizations. And I think that the best thing for organizations to do and for learning leaders to do is to just take a step back and think and take your learning hat on and put your performance hat on or your business hat on and think about what are we here to do? And the answer is, well, we're here to help our business solve problems, take advantage of opportunities. We're here to help people in our business, people in our organization in their careers, but that's not all we're here for. We're here, they won't have a career if the organization isn't successful and doesn't continue. So we have to think about that. And my colleagues and I have developed a methodology that we call now performance-based learning methodology. It's based around 70-20-10, but and we wrote a book about it 7 years ago now, called 70-20-10 towards 100% performance. And in it, we defined 5 roles, and they are not people, they're just roles, things that need to be done. And in those roles, there's a set of 32 tasks, critical tasks that need to be carried out. And I think it's worthwhile for L&D leaders to think about these, because those 5 roles, you'll recognize some, others you won't. So the first role is what we call a performance detective. And so that's being able to carry out high quality performance analysis. That's not learning analysis, it's performance analysis. In other words, asking, what's the current situation? What do you want to be the outcome? And what do we need to, let's unpick what the root cause of that problem is. And I mentioned when we were speaking earlier that very often the root cause of an issue is not due to lack of skill, it's not due to lack of knowledge. It's actually due to the fact that the processes we have in place are not fit for purpose, or the quality of leadership we have in terms of our team leaders or our senior leaders is not sort of aligning us all behind the right purpose. So that performance detective role is really critical, because if that's not done, you're never going to get the right solution. You're never going to build the right solution. So number 1, performance detective. The second role we defined, we call the performance architect. And again, you might think that's a bit like a learning architect. Well, there's learning architecture in there. But again, it's looking at what is the best mix of solutions and how can we bring everything we have to hand together to help solve that particular problem. And the problem might be a capability problem within a bit of the organization. It might be, a problem, there might be a problem in terms of, say you're working in a production environment of the factory. It might be that you've got large numbers of outages or the quality of production is down. How do we address that? And again, very often L&D people will say, well, we need just to train people to do it better. That might help, but that's not certainly rarely going to be the full solution. So that performance architect is the second one. The third role is what we call the performance master builder. And again, L&D people would say, well, that's just instructional design and building it. Yeah, that's part of it. But actually, it's also looking at all the other tools that we have and things such as we've been talking about, how do we harness user-generated content? And how do we make sure that's harnessed, filtered, if it needs filtering, and shared effectively? How do we use that? How do we use the technologies that underpin that in our solution? It would be, and this is an area I've been focused on for years and years, and I can't understand why there's a blind spot in L&D, and that is performance support. How can we provide the right support for people to carry out those tasks at the point they need to carry them out, or near the point they need to carry out? And again, I spent some time, I went to the training center at NASA in Florida a few years ago, and I wandered around the cases there with all the artifacts from the moon landings. And those guys were doing really complex, difficult work, and everything was driven by checklists. There were little booklets and checklists for everything they needed to do. Well, a lot of our work, the people we work with, have complex things. We should be doing things like providing performance support. A checklist is worth a hell of a lot more than running a training course that most people will forget, within a day or two of leaving it. So the Performance Master Builder looks at everything they have to bring together. Then there's the fourth role is what we call the Performance Game Changer. And that's really project management, having good project management skills. But also it's about how do we embed our solutions, our learning solutions, in the culture of our organization. And L&D generally is not very good at that. I worked on a big project with Citibank called Be More, which was all about helping change. They were moving from basically it was from courses to campaigns. Of course, they still run lots of courses at Citibank, but it was helping embed learning in the workplace. And that performance game changer role was mainly carried out by the marketing team, not the L&D marketing team, but by the marketing team and the corporate communications team, because they are really good at getting messaging done well. And the fifth role of these 5 roles is we call the performance tracker, and that is defining the metrics that we're going to use, what is meaning for our stakeholder. And that role is actually often in the same body. For the small L&D team, the performance detective and the performance tracker are the same person, because actually that work that the tracker does, the initial work, needs to be done right at the start. Because when we work on a project, we need to know how we're going to measure the impact, because why would we start doing it? If we don't know the metrics that we're going to use before we start, why would we start? So those roles, the performance detective, the architect, the master builder, the game changer, and the tracker, are generic roles. But I think that we should be looking at that in terms of what capabilities do we need in our L&D teams to deliver really valuable service to our organization, and move from just being order takers. In other words, someone comes in and says we need to update our sales training course, or we need to update our health and safety programs or whatever, into being really changing the performance in the organization, really being performance enablers.
Yeah, they're really good steps, those five roles that you're talking about, Charles. That's really good. I suppose some other elements that we need to weave in as well, I believe, is like moving the mindset from, as you said, being order takers and just by default going to our safe zone. And the safe zone may be learning design and development, to use those terms. And then beyond that, as you said, you've touched on campaigns, and then the opportunities that it has as, with social learning, user-generated content, data analytics that we mentioned, of maybe we don't refer to ourselves as much, or some of learning design and learning development. We're more sort of moderators, as you said, detectives, curators, and learning analysts as well starts to play into it, which changes the total mindset from L&D, learning design, versus all those other elements that we just talked about.
Absolutely. I worked with a man called Jay Cross for quite a few years, and Jay was a great advocate of informal learning. And Jay often said, the trouble that we have is that many people can't differentiate between learning and schooling, because we've all been through, school and college and university or whatever. And so therefore, a lot of people, the default the default response is formal learning, is schooling. So, you know, we need to, and actually L&D it's got pretty good at that. I mean, there's some really, really good design approaches. There's some really, really good formal learning you see. But the point is, I think we need to look beyond that, because formal learning alone, and I said this earlier on, formal learning alone may get you to competence. You may be able to tick the box and say, yes, people can demonstrate competence at these levels. But if you're looking to build high performance, formal learning alone is never going to be able to do that. So we need to think sort of outside of that. And those 5 roles are designed on the principle, and the methodology behind that is not on building competencies. It's on executing critical tasks. How do top people do their work? How do you approach a problem? How do you solve a problem? How do you carry out your day-to-day work? It could be anything from, you know, you might be working at a check-in in an airport. It could be that you're a neurosurgeon or whatever. It doesn't matter. It's around how do you execute the tasks that you have as part of your role. And if you start to think, and to your point, you know, if you start to change your mindset to think about that and think about how is what we're doing helping people get better at what they do, that's, you know, I've said that for years. I said, you know, this isn't a difficult industry. No, it's not difficult for us. Our job is to help people and organizations get better at what they do. And if you have that mindset, I think that helps, because you don't get bogged down in, you know, the intricate details of instructional design. Sometimes maybe you need to, because if you're going to produce a well-structured and an effective formal learning program, you need to do that. But don't make that your life's work, because if that's your life's work, you're never going to actually really make a change. You know, you might get a whole pile of people competent, ready to start their jobs, ready to move into their new roles, but it's never going to really change the needle in terms of performance.
From what we're talking about, and I was thinking about the other day, and I've put a diagram, and I'll share the diagram through as we're talking, of mapping some of the information we're talking about. So we talked about user-generated content and changing from staged formal learning events to sort of campaign to subject matter experts and empowering them with, you know, user-generated content. We talked about moving from just, you know, static looking internally in terms of tracking, reporting completions and who clicked buttons and the like, versus measuring performance and the experiences and performance with back to the business's KPIs. We're now just talking about the different roles and, you know, how we change our mindset and look around learning and development, design and development in terms of adding value back to the business. And then I started to see a relationship between the 70-20-10 model and directly what we're talking about. And the diagram that I've put together sort of emphasizes that. So if we look at the 10% of formal learning is where the mindset largely is to a degree in terms of learning design, learning development, staged events, tracking basic level of data that maybe is inward looking. And, you know, arguably we're sitting in learning development as a cost center, versus we flip that around to the 20 and the 70, where most of the learning and experience and performance sits. I see, you know, that's when we start looking at, you know, subject matter experts having the information we need, speed to create and get that training together with user-generated content, mapping the performance, and then we move. And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this, Charles, of mapping that 70-20-10 to that model of moving towards a value add as opposed to focusing on that 10% only and being more of a cost center.
Yeah, I think that, well, certainly my experience is that we need to look across the whole lot, you know. And one of the things that I've often talked about is that many people, when they first come across the 70-20-10 framework, they see it as being separating. Let's put a bucket of formal learning here, a bucket of social learning here, a bucket of learning in the workplace there. That's not what 70-20-10 is, certainly not to me. It's around how do we integrate all of these things. So, you know, we're humans, like a lot of animals, are sort of learning machines, you know, where we learn from, in fact, before we're born to, you know, till the day we die. There are opportunities for us to learn. And our role is to actually bring all those together. And if we're going to be really effective, that 20 and that 70, that learning with and through others, and that learning from working are really critical, because that's where, you know, the learning really happens. And again, it's not just me saying that. You know, the European Research Centre for Education and the Labour Market in the Netherlands produced some data that shows that around about, I think it's about 94% of the time that we have as working adults to learn, 94% of the time we're learning is actually when we're working. It's not when we're...
So on that, Charles, just so people don't, I've heard people get hung up on the numbers, specific numbers as well. We're talking the 70-20-10 is all centered around principles.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's right, Rob. And in fact, you know, the numbers in the original bit of research from the Centre for Creative Leadership, the numbers weren't 70-20-10. Now I forget they were 68 and, you know, whatever. They weren't nice neat numbers, but Bob Eichinger looked at actually there were 16 dimensions that the researchers identified. And Bob looked at it and said, look, this isn't going to fly because, you know, people won't understand it. It looks like roughly about this amount, you know, about 90% of learning is through rich and challenging experiences, making mistakes, working with others, you know, working on challenging projects and working on projects that go really well, that sort of stuff. And we all know that. I mean, I've been asking a question of people when I speak at events for the last 10 years or so. And that is, if you think about back to one great learning experience that you had in your life, you know, one that really stands out. It may have been when you were a child and a parent taught you to ride a bike or ride a surfboard or whatever it happens to be. Or it may have been, you know, yesterday when you were working on a project and you reflected on, you know, you had a great success or a real problem and you thought, that's fantastic, or I'm never going to do that again. And when you ask people the question to identify, think about one great learning experience in their life, I've asked that question to more than 100,000 people. And usually more than 80% of people say it was while I was trying to complete a task. It wasn't when I was, you know, we've all had, you know, great teachers and great professors at university and so on, but it wasn't when I was actually in a formal mindset of thinking about learning. It was when I was trying to do something and I realized, or someone showed me how to do it better, or as a team, we worked on it and we worked out how to do it better. That's the real learning. And that sort of learning, Rod, tends to be invisible. It's certainly invisible to a lot of L&D professionals. You know, I've had discussions with people say, well, actually, you know, we can't justify focusing on learning in the workplace because we can't see it happening. And the answer is, it's because we don't look hard enough or we're not looking in the right way. So the 70-20-10 is not about the numbers. It's a framework, it's a reference model. I've always seen it simply as a way to focus and extend our thinking about learning. You know, learning as an input to improved outcomes, which might be individual performance outcomes, they might be performance of our organization, it might be increased agility, you know, opportunities and taking opportunities to change. It could be all those sorts of things. So it's sort of thinking holistically about the role that we have as professionals in learning and development. And actually, my goodness me, you know, it's an important role. It really is. But not if we sit in the corner and churn out courses and measure. And again, I don't want to criticize Don Kirkpatrick at all, but you know, if we're using the Kirkpatrick model and say, okay, we measure, you know, the engagement levels, we measure the learning levels, or actually often Kirkpatrick, the learning level, the Kirkpatrick 2 is not even learning, it's often just short-term memory retention. You know, then we measure the impact. Well, getting people to say, yes, I've used this in my job. Yeah, that might be useful bit of data, but it doesn't really tell us, you know, we'd like to know, okay, has your team improved its output over the last whatever? And can we show some sort of causal link there, or can we not? So, you know, measurement is a real challenge, but if we sit in that traditional formal learning box and design courses, programs, e-learning modules without thinking about the problems we're trying to solve, and then without having stakeholder metrics to measure that, you know, we're never going to move from being order takers really, or from being learning and what we call learning enablers. You know, and there's some really, really good academies that do great work, but actually we've all seen it in the last 2 years, when push comes to shove, often the budgets to those academies get trimmed because the senior leaders don't see the real value because they've never been shown the real value. And that's a problem, you know, we all need to face.
Yep. You know, the irony behind that is the speed and cost economy or efficiency of user-generated content at the same time compared to the formal learning. Because I know I might share that diagram with the video, but yeah, moving from that 10% up to the end of the 70 doesn't necessarily mean that we need higher budgets and longer timelines. Arguably, you could argue the opposite.
Absolutely, I think you're right, and I think where user-generated content is really potentially very powerful is that you have, you know, most organizations have a large number of people in the workforce who have high levels of expertise and who are happy to share that expertise. And if you're not going to acknowledge that and provide the ways in which they can do it, you know, it's really foolish, because the other model, which is much slower, the traditional model for L&D was you'll identify a couple of SMEs, a couple of subject matter experts. Often they're identified for you by maybe their manager, and then, or even the manager themselves put themselves forward and say, you know, I know everything they need to know. These people need to know. I would never take that as written. I would always say I want to observe high performers. We have those, so the standard model for L&D is we take those people, we sort of do a brain dump from them into us. We then redesign, use our instructional design skills to construct you know, a construct of the information, and we feed it back to everyone. And actually it's quite slow, you know, and going through that process is often not fast enough. It's really wrought with challenges, because if you take one SME and assume that that SME knows everything there is to know, you're going to miss things. So getting, you know, I suppose the hive mind, and again, it's all to do with increasing democratization in organizations and things like that. I think all of these play together, which say, well, actually, let's just be adult about this. Let's think about how we can exploit the expertise that we have and use it, and therefore creating, and to be honest, Rod, you know, I've seen the big consultancy companies have been doing this for years, you know, where they have sort of knowledge exchanges, and they have ways in which they, you know, they have systems where you can, if I'm, for example, working for, I'll pick one, you know, if I'm working for PwC and I'm due to start on a project in Hong Kong with Bank of America, I can look and see who's worked with Bank of America in Hong Kong, who's worked in Hong Kong, who's worked on this sort of project before, and I can immediately, you know, make connections and learn from that and get that real context. So as I say, and it's not just big consultancies. I mean, lots of organizations do this, and I think that's totally out with L&D. L&D doesn't have any visibility of that, and L&D should have visibility of that, and that's what, for me, the whole framework of 70-20-10 is saying, okay, let's look at every opportunity we've got in the way that we can exploit learning for a specific outcome, which is to improve organizational performance, team performance, and individual performance.
I had a presentation the other day, and I was explaining the speed of the content and user-generated content. I used the metaphor of a snowball. So we're training someone of how to hold and manage a snowball. So we need gloves. It's frosty. It burns your fingers, and that sort of knowledge information gets passed down to someone else. Now, noting that it's 40-degree day where you are at the moment in the UK, so you can imagine that snowball. And if we did that for a 10-minute session outside, and then the person we train here of how to hold and manage that snowball, if they paraphrase and that wrote and that sort of transferring the knowledge down, you know, we're going to be in an invisible snowball at 40 degrees where you are at the moment. So
disappear pretty quickly.
Yeah, so we're going to move from gloves to a towel to a bucket to nothing. So I guess there's that speed. We need to be, you know, operating faster, and that, you know, that knowledge that we acquire through experiences, we need to start putting back into how we, you know, operate and train people, you know, faster and more accurately and more performance based.
Yeah, it's speed and context as well. You know, we all know learning is highly contextual. And again, we've known that for, I mean, there was a publication by a couple of leading American psychologists in 1901. So we're talking about 121 years ago. that they call the principle of identical elements. And what they were showing in those days, they were talking about the transfer of practice, which is, still something that we're focused on today. And what they showed was that the closer, the more elements in the context of where you learn something, the more identical elements there are to where you're going to use it, the easier the learning is, and the more effective the learning is. In other words, so it's not just speed. Getting the speed and sharing and getting things out and really quickly is really important, but also making sure that the learning, the opportunities to use that user-generated content and so on in the context of where I'm going to use it, it's going to be more effective. And again, that's a difficult challenge for many L&D people who have built their work in terms of taking people away from their role, away from the workplace, and learning and going back into the workplace. If you can integrate those two together, it's likely to be more effective.
Yep. Well, conscious of time, Charles, and I really appreciate your time to talk through some of these points and thinking about things a little bit differently and chewing through some ideas and what learning and development can do, and start thinking about how we should start operating maybe in the future, and flipping around from focusing, from the formal to the less formal, and how we can facilitate. That's been really, really enjoyable. Thank you for your time.
Oh, thanks very much, Rod. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you, and I think that you're doing some really great work there. So let's keep it up. Yeah.
Thank you, Charles.